bravo, bravo. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. That was Les McCann's Could Be. Now we'll continue with something that something funky that Les wrote and that you would associate more with Les McCann. That's what often call me before a gig. Funky is thinking me. So this is that.
Bravo, bravo. Yeah, come on.
Chinese blues. And 15 years ago, I played my first big gig in New York City, and I walked out on stage, and sitting right here was Ahmad Jamal, and I was scared to death. At that point in my life, I had no idea how to approach playing in front of one of my heroes, and I was totally freaked out. I did my best, but wasn't totally happy with how it went. But I felt okay playing in front of one of my heroes a few months later when I luckily met Les McCann. And I was sound checking when he entered the club, and he was in a wheelchair. They wheeled him up to the stage, and I was so excited to be my hero. And he didn't say hello. All he said was, "Play me some blues, boy." Nervous. I did the best I could, but once again, I was very nervous. But after a few minutes, he said amen, so I knew I was doing something okay. And that was the start of our beautiful friendship. You know, we spoke every day for the 12 years from that day leading up to his passing in December 2023. And he knew that I idolized him, but he never talked down to me. He always just made it feel like we were two Ahmad Jamal or two Oscar Peterson fans on the phone together. And eventually I felt comfortable sharing the story about playing in front of Ahmad Jamal with him. And for every story I had to share with Les, he had a story that not only topped my story, but also taught me something. So I shared that with him, and he said that he had a similar story that he wanted to share with me. He said he had been playing his first big gig in Chicago, a place called the London House, and he was about to walk on stage the first night, and he looks out in the audience and he sees Oscar Peterson sitting there. So similarly, he got very nervous. He said he went over to Oscar's table and he said, "Oscar, I love you, but I cannot play in front of you." And he said Oscar said something in response that changed his life. He said, "Les, I did not come here to hear me. I came here to hear you." And that made Les feel like it was okay to be himself from then on. Me too. I wish I heard that before playing in front of him, but it was not meant to be. But Les was a very special guy, and he loved coming to France. He loved coming to Paris. He said his first gig in France was actually a triple bill. Les McCann, Ray Charles, and Count Basie. He also said that something happened with the promotion, and that people were he wasn't a known artist at the time. He said that he walked out on stage and people looked very confused because, you know, LES, people thought it was a dance troupe called the McCanns, and that's not what it was. But he would often talk to me about that night and that experience and playing here. And many times we'd be on the phone before a gig, and I'd say, like, "Les, I gotta go. If I want to make it to my gig on time, I gotta take a shower." And he would say, "Man, how are you gonna play funky if you take a shower?" Sorry to you guys. We'll do our best right now. You enjoy this next time.
Yeah. Nigga funky now. Epa, epa, ei.
Thank you so much. That was our Motown medley from the night. I heard it through the grapevine. Isn't she lovely? And Les recorded a few of Stevie Wonder's tunes. Not that song, but he recorded a few others. He actually ran into Stevie Wonder one time, and he told me that Stevie Wonder said he complimented him on some of Les's recordings of his tunes and asked Les, when are you going to record some more of my songs? And Les said, when you record some of mine. Les actually, one time he ran into Elton John, and he mistook him for Billy Joel and told him how much he loved his song Just the Way You Are. But one of the things I really loved about Les was that he put his spin on popular tunes like that. And same with the pianist, the great pianist Ramsey Lewis, who I was lucky to get to know as well. And this next song predates The In Crowd, which was Ramsey's first big hit. This was actually the song that got Ramsey his first bit of gigs when he was starting out. This is called Delilah. so excited because they both have my favorite sounds. And I thought, finally I'm going to learn how to sound like that. But they both made it very clear to me pretty quickly that I will never sound like them because we haven't lived the same lives. And so they encouraged me to lean into my life and to who I am. They made me realize that trying to sound like anyone except for myself was totally missing the point. So they really encouraged me to explore my sound and to compose music. So I wanted to play an original song now. I'm from Atlanta, and I saw a nice sunset one day and wrote a nice song about it. So this is called Georgia Sunset. Hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, ATL in the house.
Thank you very much for Georgia Sunset. How about once again for Victor Nyberg on the bass? Romain Saran on the drums. We're having a lot of fun tonight. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's been such a treat to play for you. Well, I'd like to close tonight with another original. I hope you don't mind. And this song I wrote in April 2019. I could not think of the title until April 2020. After all my gigs had been canceled because of the pandemic, and I was sitting at home with more time than ever to spend at the piano, but with nothing to prepare for, except for a few Zoom concerts here. But I decided to ask myself the question, what do you want to play? And I was trying to find some joy in all of that. That's what finally came to me. The upside of down. And to me, that's what jazz is all about. You know, the happy stuff is happier, the sad stuff has hope in it. You know, Louis Armstrong said, "It hurts so good." The great John Griffin said that jazz is music made by and for people who choose to feel good in spite of conditions.
Yeah, talk about it now.
Yes, so I hope you enjoy the upside of down, and I hope we've made you smile tonight.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Bravo, bravo. Eno, yeah, Eno. One more. One more.
We got time for one more.